Hash alone and pregnant, the widow spent her last $5 on a wounded man, then he spoke her husband's name. The man bleeding out on her porch didn't belong there, but neither did the tiny coffin buried under the cottonwood tree. Sarah Callahan pressed $5 into the doctor's palm, her last coins, and wondered if saving strangers was just another way to punish herself. The November wind carved through Mineral Ridge like a dull blade, rattling the shutters of her small cabin and scattering rust-colored leaves across the yard. Sarah watched Doc Brennan work by lamplight, his thick fingers probing the stranger's shoulder where a bullet had torn through muscle and lodged near bone. The man's face was pale beneath trailed dust and stubble, his breathing shallow. Blood had soaked through his shirt and vest, darkening the floorboards she'd scrubbed just that morning. "He won't make it through the night without this coming out," Doc Brennan muttered, not looking up. "And even then, infection's likely." Sarah folded her arms over the swell of her belly. 5 months along now, maybe 6. Just do what you can. She'd found him an hour before sunset, collapsed against the fence post near the road. At first she'd thought he was drunk or dead, but then she'd seen the blood trail and the way his hand still gripped his saddle bag like it held something precious. There was no horse in sight. Whatever had happened to him, he'd crawled the last stretch on pure stubbornness. Foolish, maybe, to bring him inside. A pregnant widow living alone had no business inviting trouble across her threshold. But the alternative was leaving him to die in the dirt, and Sarah had seen enough death to last 3 lifetimes. Doc Brennan extracted the bullet with a pair of forceps, the metallic clink as he dropped it into a tin dish, making Sarah's stomach turn. The stranger groaned but didn't wake. His face twitched with pain, even in unconsciousness. "I'll check on him tomorrow," the doctor said, wiping his hands on a rag already stained rust brown. He glanced at Sarah with the same expression he'd worn 6 months ago when he'd told her Thomas was gone, pity mixed with helplessness. "You sure about this, Mrs. Callahan? Man could be an outlaw, could be running from something worse." "Everyone's running from something," she said quietly. After Doc Brennan left, Sarah sat in the rocking chair by the window and listened to the stranger breathe. She should have been afraid, should have at least asked more questions before handing over every cent she had. But fear felt distant now, like something that belonged to a different woman. The old Sarah would have waited for Thomas to make decisions, would have trusted his steady presence to keep the world at bay. The new Sarah just did what seemed right in the moment and hoped it didn't kill her. The baby moved inside her, a flutter like bird wings against her ribs. She rested one hand on her belly and closed her eyes. Thomas had been so excited when she'd told him. He'd picked her up and spun her around the kitchen until she'd laughed and begged him to stop. They'd stayed up late that night planning names, imagining a future that stretched out like open prairie. He'd promised to build a bigger house, to fence off more land for cattle, to give their child everything this hard country tried to take away. Then the horse had thrown him. One moment of bad luck, a rattlesnake in the tall grass, a spooked mare, and he was gone, broken neck, dead before Doc Brennan could even get to the ranch. Sarah had buried him herself, with help from neighbors who'd stopped coming around once the casseroles ran out and the sympathy wore thin. A widow with a baby on the way and no family wasn't much of a neighbor, just another mouth that might need feeding come winter. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes the room was darker and the stranger was awake. He stared at the ceiling with glassy eyes, his lips moving soundlessly. Sarah stood slowly, her back aching, and approached the bed. "You're safe," she said, keeping her voice low. "Doctor took the bullet out, you need to rest." His gaze slid toward her, unfocused. For a moment she thought he'd slip back under, but then his mouth worked, and words came out hoarse and broken. Thomas Callahan." Sarah's heart stopped. The room seemed to tilt sideways. "What did you say?" But the stranger's eyes had already closed, his breathing evening out into the rhythm of deep unconsciousness. Sarah stood there frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears, the name hanging in the air like smoke. It took her 3 tries to light the lantern with shaking hands. She held it over the stranger's face, studying him properly for the first time. He was maybe 30, weathered by sun and hard living, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, Nothing about him was familiar. She'd never seen this man before in her life. So how did he know Thomas's name? Sleep wouldn't come. Sarah lay in the small back bedroom, the room that was supposed to become the nursery, and watched moonlight creep across the wall. Questions circled like vultures. Had Thomas known this man? Had they worked together, ridden together? Thomas had spent years as a ranch hand before they'd married, drifting from outfit to outfit. He'd never talked much about those days. Or maybe the stranger had known Thomas a different way. Maybe he'd been there when the horse threw him. Maybe he'd seen it happen. Maybe he'd caused it. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut against the thought. She was being paranoid. Grief did that, made you see shadows in every corner. Most likely explanation was simple coincidence. Thomas Callahan wasn't an uncommon name. The stranger could have been talking about someone else entirely. But the timing felt too strange, too deliberate, like God was testing her faith or playing some cruel joke she didn't understand. When dawn finally broke, Sarah made coffee and fried eggs she barely tasted. The stranger hadn't stirred all night. She checked his bandages, relieved to find them clean and dry. No fever yet, that was something. She was washing dishes when she heard him cough. By the time she reached the bedside, he was trying to sit up, his face contorted with pain. "Easy," she said, pressing a hand to his good shoulder. "You'll tear the stitches." He sagged back against the pillow, breathing hard. "Where am I?" "My home, about 2 miles outside Mineral Ridge." She poured water from the pitcher and held the cup to his lips. He drank greedily, water dribbling down his chin. "What's your name?" "Cole," he winced. "Cole Brennan, no relation to the doc before you ask." "Who shot you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Better if you don't know." "I spent my last $5 keeping you alive. I think I've earned some answers." His eyes met hers then, and she saw wariness there, the look of a man used to keeping secrets, but also something else. Resignation, maybe, or exhaustion. "I was writing dispatch for a mining company up near Sutter's Creek," he said finally, "carrying payroll. 3 men jumped me on the road. They got the money, but I got one of them in the leg before they put a bullet in me." He coughed again, "Left me for dead." It sounded true enough. Rough men did rough things out here, and payroll robberies were common as rain. But Sarah's instincts, those new instincts she'd developed since becoming a widow, whispered that he was holding something back. "Last night," she said carefully, "you said a name, Thomas Callahan." Cole's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Did I?" "You did." He looked away, toward the window where morning light spilled across the floorboards. "Must have been fever talking, don't remember saying anything." "That was my husband's name." Now he did react, a slight tightening around his mouth, a barely perceptible tension in his shoulders. "Was. He died 6 months ago." "I'm sorry." The words felt automatic, hollow. Sarah crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, alone in this cabin with a stranger who might be lying about everything. "How did you know his name?" "I didn't, like I said, fever talking." "You're lying." Cole closed his eyes. "Lady, I appreciate what you did for me, but I need to rest. When I'm strong enough to ride, I'll be gone and you can forget I was ever here." "Answer my question." "Can't help you." Frustration boiled up hot and sharp in Sarah's chest. She wanted to shake him, to demand the truth, but he looked half dead already, and violence wouldn't get her anywhere. Instead, she turned and walked out, letting the door slam harder than necessary. Outside, the wind had picked up. Sarah stood on the porch and tried to calm her racing thoughts. Maybe she should ride into town, tell Sheriff Palmer about the stranger in her house, let him sort it out. But what if Cole was telling the truth about the robbery? What if men were still looking for him? Getting the law involved could bring more trouble down on her head. And if she was being honest with herself, part of her didn't want him gone yet. Not until she understood how he'd known Thomas's name. Not until she'd wrung every answer out of him. The next 3 days passed in strange, tense quiet. Cole grew stronger, able to sit up and take solid food. Sarah tended his wound morning and evening, changing bandages and checking for infection. They didn't talk much. He seemed content to sleep and stare out the window, while she busied herself with chores, feeding the chickens, chopping wood, mending clothes that had needed mending for months. On the fourth day, she found him standing in the kitchen when she came in from the barn. He dressed in his own clothes, bloodstained and dusty, but whole. His left arm hung in a makeshift sling. "Leaving?" she asked. "Should have left 2 days ago. I'm putting you at risk being here." Sarah set down the bucket of eggs. "Are those men still looking for you?" "Probably." He moved toward the door, slow and careful. "I'll find my way back to town, see about getting a horse." "You don't have any money." "I'll figure something out." "Cole," she said his name firmly, and he stopped. "You owe me the truth." He stood there with his hand on the doorframe, his back to her. For a moment she thought he'd just walk out and never look back. Then his shoulders slumped. "Your husband," he said quietly, "I knew him long time ago." Sarah's breath caught. "How?" "We rode together, down in New Mexico, maybe 8 years back, working cattle for a ranch near Alamogordo." 8 years before Sarah had even met Thomas. She tried to picture him younger, harder, living a life she'd never been part of. "Were you friends?" "More like acquaintances. We worked the same outfit for a season, then moved on." Cole finally turned to face her. "Last I heard, he'd settled down somewhere in Colorado, got married. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." It made sense, and yet it felt incomplete. Why say his name when you were half dead on my floor? Cole hesitated. "Because I recognized you." Sarah blinked. "That's impossible. We never met." "Not in person, but Thomas used to carry a photograph, small thing, kept it in his vest pocket. He'd show it around sometimes when he'd had a few drinks, brag about the pretty girl waiting for him back home." Cole's expression softened slightly. "I recognized your face when I woke up, put 2 and 2 together." The explanation landed like truth this time, solid and sad. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, not quite relief, but close. "He really talked about me all the time, drove the rest of us crazy." The corner of Cole's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "He was a good man. I'm sorry you lost him." This time, the words didn't sound hollow. Sarah turned away before he could see her eyes water. She busied herself putting the eggs in a bowl, focusing on the smooth weight of each shell. "Stay for breakfast, then I'll drive you into town in the wagon." "You don't have to." "I'm not asking." They ate in silence, eggs and bacon and biscuits Sarah had made the night before. Cole didn't talk about Thomas again, and Sarah didn't push. Some things were better left alone, tucked away like old photographs in a vest pocket. Afterward, she hitched the mule to the wagon while Cole gathered his things. The ride into Mineral Ridge took half an hour over rutted roads that made the wagon bounce and creak. Sarah kept one hand on her belly, feeling the baby shift and settle with each jolt. The town was small and dusty, lined with false front buildings that looked weary even in morning light. Sarah pulled up outside the general store. Cole climbed down carefully, favoring his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Sarah nodded. "Be careful if those men are still around." "I will." He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. "Mrs. Callahan, your husband used to say you were the strongest person he'd ever met, stronger than any man he'd ridden with." Cole's eyes were steady on hers. "I didn't understand what he meant until now." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and disappeared around the corner. Sarah sat in the wagon for a long moment, watching townspeople move about their business. A woman in a blue dress swept the boardwalk outside the millinery. 2 men argued over a horse in front of the saloon. Life continuing on like it always did, indifferent to grief and small miracles. She thought about Thomas carrying her photograph, showing it to rough men around campfires. She thought about Cole recognizing her face through fever and pain. She thought about how strange it was that the universe had dropped this wounded stranger on her porch just when she'd needed proof that Thomas had loved her the way she'd loved him. The baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp. I know, she murmured, resting both hands on her belly. I know. She was about to drive home when she spotted Sheriff Palmer crossing the street. He raised a hand in greeting, and Sarah's stomach sank. No avoiding him now. Mrs. Callahan, he said, tipping his hat, heard you had a visitor out at your place. Of course, Doc Brennan had told him. Sarah kept her expression neutral. Man was hurt. I helped him. He's gone now. That man's name, Cole Brennan. That's what he said. Palmer scratched his jaw. Got word from up north. 3 men robbed a mining payroll near Sutter's Creek. Shot the dispatch rider. They're still looking for him. Think he might have survived. He did survive, because I pulled a bullet out of him and kept him alive. Sarah held the sheriff's gaze. If you're asking whether he deserved it, I can't help you. I just saw a man bleeding to death. Palmer was quiet for a moment. Those men who did the shooting, they're dangerous. If they think Brennan talked to someone, they might come looking. Then I guess you should find them before they find me. The sheriff sighed. You're a stubborn woman, Sarah Callahan. Runs in the family. She left him standing there and drove the wagon out of town, back toward the cabin that sat small and lonely against the big Montana sky. The wind had died down, leaving the afternoon still and heavy. Crows called from the cottonwoods. When she reached home, Sarah unhitched the mule and led him to the barn. She scattered feed for the chickens, checked the fence line, brought in firewood for the stove. Normal tasks, ordinary rhythms, but something had shifted inside her, subtle as seasons changing. That night she sat in the rocking chair and wrote a letter to Thomas's mother back in Pennsylvania, the first letter she'd written since the funeral. She told her about the baby, about the cabin, about how hard the work was, but how she was managing. She didn't mention Cole Brennan or the robbery or the photograph Thomas used to carry. Some stories weren't meant for letters. 3 weeks later, on a cold morning when frost glittered on the grass, Sarah was hanging laundry when she saw a rider coming up the road. Her heart jumped into her throat. The men from the robbery, she thought wildly, but as the figure drew closer, she recognized Cole's lean frame and careful way of sitting the saddle. He pulled up by the fence. His shoulder looked healed, and he'd cleaned up considerably. Mrs. Callahan. Cole, she set down the laundry basket. Thought you'd be long gone by now. Got as far as Billings, then figured I owed you a debt. You don't owe me anything. Let me finish. He dismounted slowly. I talked to some people, found out there's a ranch about 10 miles west looking for hands. Owner's an older fellow, needs help with the winter work. I told him I knew someone who might be interested, a widow with property, hard worker, expecting a baby. Sarah stared at him. Why would you do that? Because Thomas would have wanted someone looking out for you. Cole pulled an envelope from his coat. Owner's name is Henry Marsh. This is a letter of introduction. If you're interested, ride out there and talk to him. He'll pay fair wages and he's a decent man, I made sure. She took the envelope with numb fingers. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, just think about it. Cole swung back into the saddle. And Mrs. Callahan, those men who robbed the payroll, sheriff caught 2 of them up near the border. The 3rd ran off to Wyoming. You don't have to worry about them anymore. Relief washed through her so sudden and complete she nearly swayed. Thank you. Cole tipped his hat. Take care of yourself and that baby. He rode away without looking back, disappearing down the road until he was just a dark speck against the horizon. Sarah stood there holding the letter, feeling the weight of possibility in her hands. That night she sat at the kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. Then she pulled out paper and ink and began making plans. The job with Henry Marsh turned out to be everything Cole had promised. The old rancher was gruff but kind, and his wife Ellen fussed over Sarah like a mother hen. They gave her work she could manage, bookkeeping, mending, cooking for the ranch hands, and in return she earned enough to buy winter supplies and put a little away for when the baby came. Sarah moved through December and January in a haze of work and waiting. Her belly grew round and heavy. The baby kicked constantly, restless as a caged animal. Some days were hard, when loneliness crept in like cold air through cracks in the walls, but other days were bearable, even good. She thought about Thomas less and less, though she never stopped loving him. The grief had transformed into something quieter, something she could carry without it breaking her. And when she felt the baby move, she imagined Thomas's excitement all over again, that joy that had been cut short but never erased. On a February morning, when snow covered the ground and her contractions started just after dawn, Ellen Marsh drove her to Doc Brennan's house in town. The labor lasted 14 hours. Sarah screamed and swore and prayed, riding waves of pain that felt like they'd split her in half. Then suddenly there was a baby, a tiny, red-faced, furious baby with Thomas's dark hair and her own grey eyes. A boy, perfect and impossible. "What'll you name him?" Ellen asked, wiping tears from her own cheeks. Sarah held her son against her chest and felt his heartbeat sync with hers. She thought about the photograph Thomas used to carry, about Cole Brennan riding back to deliver hope when she'd needed it most, about all the ways life surprised you when you thought you had nothing left. "Caleb," she said. "His name is Caleb." Spring came early that year. By March, the snow had melted and green shoots pushed through mud. Sarah returned to her cabin with Caleb bundled in blankets, and together they learned how to survive, feeding and sleeping and crying in the dark hours before dawn. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was hers, built from nothing by sheer stubborn will. One afternoon in April, when Caleb was sleeping and Sarah was hanging laundry, she saw a rider on the road. For one wild moment, she thought it might be Cole again, but this man was broader, older. He stopped at her gate and called out, "Mrs. Callahan, name's Henry Gibbs. I'm looking for work and heard you might need a hand around the place." Sarah studied him, weathered face, honest eyes, hands scarred from hard labor. "Who told you that?" "Fellow named Cole Brennan. Said you'd done him a good turn once." She almost laughed. Of course Cole was still looking out for her, even from wherever he'd drifted to next. "Can you mend fences?" she called back. "Yes, ma'am. Chop wood. Done it all my life." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron. "Wages are low and the work's hard, but there's a bunkhouse out back and 3 meals a day." Henry Gibbs smiled. "Sounds like heaven." As he rode through the gate, Sarah turned back to her laundry. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and new grass. Somewhere inside the cabin, Caleb started to cry, that thin, insistent wail that meant he was hungry. Sarah smiled and went to feed her son. Behind her, the cottonwood tree swayed in the breeze, its branches heavy with green leaves. Beneath it, Thomas's grave lay quiet in the shade. The small wooden marker she'd carved herself was already weathering, the letters growing faint. But the love wasn't fading. It had just changed shape, stretching forward instead of backward, becoming something she could build on instead of something that buried her. Sarah lifted Caleb into her arms and walked to the window. Outside, Henry Gibbs was already examining the fence line, making notes about what needed fixing. The chickens scratched in the yard. The mule dozed in the barn. Everything ordinary, everything impossible. "Your daddy would have loved you," she whispered against Caleb's soft hair, "but I love you enough for both of us." The baby quieted, his tiny hand curling around her finger. And in that moment, standing in the cabin she'd refused to lose, holding the child she'd fought to bring into the world, Sarah Callahan felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt like she might actually survive this. More than that, she felt like she might even be happy.